All right, we're good to go.
Thank you, David. Good morning, everyone. My name is David Flynn. We're going to wait maybe another minute to let some others join us this morning and welcome you to our program. Okay, well, I think we'll get started. We're respectful of everyone's time and we appreciate you joining us this morning. The title of this program is How to Make Your Data Center Project a Reality. And we chose that title very specifically because so much is going on in the data center space. And in my view, there's a lot of noise out there. There's misinformation. There's multiple projects being announced that seemingly, flash in the pan and go away and you never hear about them anymore. And it's important for all of us for a number of reasons to be able to focus on those projects that are real, that are going to cross the finish line, that are going to become operational, because that's where the rubber hits the road. And as practitioners, as developers, as energy professionals, whatever your slice of this pie might be, you of course want to be able to focus on projects that are a reality and not totally speculative or just out there in the netherworld floating around that never seem to land and become a real project. And that was our goal, and that is our goal for this morning, is to talk about how do you help identify those projects, number one, and number two, what are some insights that allow you to take a conceptual project from concept through the arduous process of siting, permitting, obtaining the energy you're going to need for your project, and actually be able to be at a ribbon cutting at some point saying our data center is now open. And that's critical in our view, and we're glad you could all join us this morning. My name is David Flynn. I head up our environmental practice here at Phillips Lytle, and I co-lead our energy practice team. And I worked with a group here this morning that you can see on your screen that I think can help develop and tease out some of the key concepts, some of the key thoughts you should be thinking as you're looking either to become involved in a data center project, may already be involved in a data center project, or are in a tangential role with a data center project. A little bit of housekeeping on the front end. On the bottom right corner of your screen, there's an apps button. If you click on that, you'll see an app called Slido, S-L-I-D-O. That's what we're using for the Q&A function today. It allows you to submit questions and us to assimilate those questions, and our goal is to leave about 20 minutes at the end of the program for Q&A and allow us to hopefully address some of the questions or concerns that you might have through the program. Feel free to input your questions throughout the program, and as I said, we'll catch up with them later. I'd like to introduce our panelists for this morning's program, and it's a very purposeful group because in addition to some of my colleagues here at Phillips Lytle who have worked closely with data center projects that are operational and have crossed that finish line, we thought it was critical to have a data center operator developer, someone who's actually ridden that horse out of the gate and crossed the finish line in the sense of having an operational data center. And we could think of no one better than our friend and client, Kant Trivedi, who co-founded Block Fusion and serves as its chief operating officer, and has worked to scale the company from inception, as I said, into a leading developer and operator of next generational infrastructure. He has 20 years of leadership experience across technology, telecommunications, and financial services industry, and has driven customer operations, business transformation, digital transformation, and growth for enterprise scale platforms. So again, someone who's really sort of not just talk the talk, but has walk the walk and has a project, a number of projects behind him to stand for that. We also have with us this morning Dennis Elsenbeck, who's head of energy and sustainability here at Phillips Lytle. Dennis is not a lawyer. We always say that. He's an energy professional, and he is the head of energy and sustainability here. He consults on energy opportunities encompassing a forward view of generation, distribution, and demand options. He advises clients involved in data center projects on energy strategy, utility engagement, and sustainability considerations critical to project development and long-term operations. Dennis was a member of the Climate Council, which was created to basically take the framework from the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act and turn it into an actionable work plan going forward. So he's got some keen insights there generally, but certainly as it relates to data centers. We also have with us this morning Lauren Adornetto. Lauren is a senior associate here at Phillips Lytle, where she concentrates her practice in the areas of land use and zoning, environmental law. She represents developers of large-scale projects, including data centers, warehouses, and industrial facilities, and renewable energy production facilities. She appears before local boards across the state in support of zoning permits, environmental reviews, and provides strategic counsel on all related aspects of compliance with the seeker permitting and land use and review process. So I welcome all of you, and let's get going with the substance. So if you're even half awake most mornings and watching the news, there's usually something there about data centers, whether it's energy, it could be protests regarding a data center, it could be a report from some town board meeting reporting that people were happy, sad, and everything in between regarding a proposed data center. But oftentimes one of the key entry points, one of the key concerns that's raised is energy related, and that is somehow if a data center is built, it's going to create this huge demand for electricity that's going to end up driving me, the homeowner, or me, the small business. It's going to drive my energy costs through the roof. It's going to threaten the availability of energy for me, and because of that, it causes me to sit back and say, I'm not sure I want a data center here, or that data centers are a positive development for our economy. So, Dennis, I'd like to turn to you and just ask you to kind of work through the noise, my common theme here this morning, and separate fact from fiction in terms of power availability, the interconnection process, and grid reliability.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Um, just to take a step back, this conversation is just not, it's not just a New York conversation. This conversation is occurring across the nation, actually across the world, which I'm sure Kant can speak to. So we're really in a competitive environment, and we're kind of blessed with the variety of services we provide because we can address those issues and then look at New York and see, is there alternatives? Is there a way that we can approach this issue differently based on what we're seeing, either nationally or internationally? But the process starts, for those who do not know, with an application that stipulates that we are seeking to grow or to attract a data center into New York. And it goes through a process. If it's greater than 10 megawatts, it has to fall under the New York System Operator process, which is the System Impact Study. If it's less than 10 megawatts at a transmission level, it is handled directly by the local electric utility. The same is true for anything that's 80 megawatts and above for subtransmission. That falls under the independent system operator. Anything below that falls under the local electric utility. The intent of the study is to really address those issues of concern on whether or not costs are being transferred to other ratepayers. The assessment is looking at the actual design of the substation, which is paid for by the data center developer. It looks at the cost of the actual interconnection to the local transmission lines. Once again, that is a cost incurred by the local developer. And it even looks at whether or not the network is stable enough to supply the level of capacity being requested. So the whole design of the system is really to make sure that the data center is actually being addressed directly. So it tries to separate whether or not there's any impact passed on to others and ensures that the developer consumes all of those costs associated with their project. Now, the interesting part is that an operating data center then also pays into standard customer charges, standard demand charges. So really, they're contributing to the overall strength of the upgrades of the transmission systems that are beyond their own, as well as contributing to the maintenance of the system across all of New York. The other side of it is most subsidies in New York, let's say like a system benefit charge or climate related subsidies, are attributed to commodity. Given that data centers are high demand, high use, their commodity is very high. So they really contribute greatly to the fixed costs associated with New York's climate programs. They really should be encouraged, not discouraged.
It's a great point, Dennis. And the point you're making as it relates to the actual cost of energy, there's kind of a knee-jerk reaction, seemingly, that if there's a number of significant consumers of electricity that come onto a system, it's just going to drive the cost of the commodity up, right? It's kind of a standard supply and demand. If there's more demand and a fixed supply, the cost has got to go up, and that's going to translate into a higher cost for me. How do you respond to that?
So, some of the concerns that we have in New York is we're actually separating the conversation of supply, demand, and delivery. We almost treat them as they're mutually exclusive issues. And under New York's climate programs, the priority is tends to be on the renewable energy. Large scale renewable energy tends to be built in green space. Some of the really creative solar and wind developers are looking at how do I actually bring that closer to where the loads are. But when you design something that is in green space, disconnected from where the location of these data centers are, what happens is you continue to stress the transmission system. But that's really the basics behind the independent system operator study. It's also what's behind the utility study is to make sure that there's always balance. Now, can we do something better than that? Absolutely. There needs to be a much more business oriented approach to how regulation works. But trying to treat a data center as if it's different than, let's say, an advanced manufacturer or a semiconductor means that you're basing it on jobs. You're not basing it on load or contribution to infrastructure.
Great. Makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Dennis. So, of the hot button issues for data center projects, certainly energy is a critical component to that. But getting through the process, the local process, right? The rezoning of a piece of property, the mandatory seeker review requirements, special use permits, all of that whole bundle of reviews and approvals that occur at the local and sometimes regional level are critical to getting a project through. And yeah, as we've all seen again from the morning news, that's some of the more active area when it comes to lower P politics, right? It's the local politics, it's the NIMBY approach that, maybe I'm not so much against data centers, but I sure as heck don't want one in my town or, across the street or something like that. And I know, Lauren, that's something that you encounter all the time, whether it's a data center project or a warehouse or any large and significant project that you've worked with. Walk us through, if you would, some of the key concerns and approaches that you use to try and manage some of those issues.
Yeah, so just from an initial starting standpoint, evaluating sites, let's say a developer has identified a site. And the first question is this data center use an emerging use treated under the local zoning code the same as any other industrial use? So just to pick up on Dennis's point that we're treating traditional manufacturers differently than data center developers for purposes of energy study, or at least the perceived reaction to their energy use. There's a similar knee-jerk reaction when a data center zoning application is being evaluated and a municipality first wraps its head around what set of approvals would be required. And then, of course, the community members themselves, the residents and neighbors, are an entirely different set of stakeholders than the municipal reviewers themselves. But of course, everybody's interests are wrapped up and aligned, and everyone's looking to address the same principal concerns. So upfront, from a zoning perspective, the initial question is this a clearly permitted use under the code? And if we proceed without any rezoning or overlay designation or special use permit because it's not clear under the code, are we left in a position where the developer is relying on potentially inconsistent interpretations of a local code based on one code enforcement official versus another? And so the key feature is to establish at the front end zoning regulations that specifically address the data center itself. And so municipalities right now are thinking of this in the context of their ordinary zoning amendments, and like we're seeing on the news every morning, statewide and at the local levels at towns, villages, and cities, a traditional zoning mechanism or land use mechanism that municipalities are using are moratoriums on data center applications. So in the zoning context, it will be an upfront pause passed by local law from the municipality that simply won't process land use applications for a data center until the local zoning code has been updated. We traditionally see 6-month moratoriums and maybe additional extension periods while the municipality is updating the regulation. But ultimately, what you're looking for is a set of identified approvals, and you want to understand how many boards are going to be implicated in the local review. There's always a legislative body, a city council, or a town board, and they may be relevant in terms of adopting the moratorium, evaluating potential standards to be applied to data centers, and ultimately adopting any set of regulations that will apply to the use. And they'll identify which approvals and which other boards will engage in the discretionary land use reviews. So for example, a site plan approval typically comes from a planning board, and that addresses just your ordinary site design. We also are seeing municipalities using special use permits to put on an additional layer of regulation for data center users. Though we would posit that they are ordinary industrial users, there are key concerns, energy, which we've just touched on, and then of course, noise is the key issue that comes up in the zoning context. And so what we see are municipalities are using their zoning regulations to tackle noise on a number of different fronts. It's not simply setting a decibel limit and requiring compliance. there's like a multifaceted approach through different zoning mechanisms to get at noise. So for example, setbacks. So if you have a site, you want to understand as you're developing it and designing your facility, are there relevant setback regulations, buffer regulations, and do those change depending on what other types of parcels the proposed site borders? So do your setback regulations differ if you're surrounded by heavily industrial properties as compared to different setbacks and buffers that might apply more extensively if you're next to a residential area? So those are the types of regulations we see with municipalities addressing noise and other impacts from data centers. We also have seen, in the context of the block fusion development, the city the city of Niagara Falls utilized some post-approval compliance conditions that allowed, as the developer, allowed block fusion to establish a certain set of noise limitations that it would operate within. And then the question for neighbors and board members as they're evaluating, is this an appropriate zoning approval to issue, is, well, once it's issued, then what? So even if we've gotten all the way through all of our zoning approvals and we've let this data center operate, what is the municipality's mechanism going to be to enforce any conditions to those zoning approvals? And so we've seen some creative approaches where sound engineering professionals can model and complete actual real world monitoring to ensure that the data center on day 600 is operating with the same noise levels as day one of the permit. So that's the general approach we see throughout municipalities handling the data center development. I guess my overarching comment would be New York has strong zoning regulations, virtually every municipality you go to. And there's, of course, that workhorse seeker in the background that's always involved in any consideration of local zoning review and approval. And those are the real tools that are there for municipalities to effectively regulate. And you can treat a data center under the same site plan and special use permit regulations that you would treat a semiconductor manufacturer. The key is this a property and a development that's consistent with surroundings? Does it meet the relevant standards set in the code? And are we bothering our neighbors? And if we can tackle all of that on the zoning front, you have a project that can benefit the community, not drive the neighbors crazy, and that boards are eager to approve because it does ultimately drive beneficial development on sites that may not be suitable for other uses. And it frankly is a use, if designed correctly, that can occur without bothering the neighbors. And I would point to Kant's facility as a precise example of that. So 3 years of extensive zoning review in a municipality with a residential neighborhood within 800 feet. Not a single negative neighbor comment came in the context of this development because we really focused on using the standards that are already in the zoning regulations and are already in seeker to drive the project design and to make sure that we were developing a project consistent with the local standards and that didn't affect neighboring land uses.
I think that's a great point, Lauren, because, you know, oftentimes when you're first proposing a project, right, the initial reaction is not positive. There's at least the silent, or I should say the loud minority at a minimum has a lot to say about data centers. And the ability to turn that around, right, through the review, the approval, the transparency of that process to create what were at best neutral parties and at worst staunch opponents to a project to a position where there's at least a symbiotic relationship between the community and the data center seems to be critical to being able to get it across the finish line. Are there any key points that you would look to there in the context of how you change that relationship between the community and the data center?
Yeah, first conflate them into one another. The data center is part of the community, particularly, for example, Block Fusion owns and operates their site themselves. There's a long-term commitment there. That's a charming narrative to be able to offer, but it's also true. These operators are members of the community. They will be hiring employees, revitalizing these sites, in many cases remediating the site. So the data center's concerns aren't necessarily antithetical to the community's concerns, and they may actually align in more places than we initially perceive. And how do we message that and engage with community feedback and also responsive feedback from the reviewing boards is we take that feedback really seriously. The land use regulations are designed to accommodate the friction between users and neighbors. And so not shying away from that, but acknowledging, okay, if there's 30 people in this room who are offering consistent comments or concerns, let's hear that. Let's restate what we heard, and let's explain how this project design is responsive, or how there are changes that can be offered in the project design that are still consistent with the regulations, that can mitigate a noise level, or can, for example, change an aesthetic impact. So the key is not to think of it as a competition, but as a source of relevant feedback to design a project that's really going to work for the developer on the site and for the community around it.
So it's creating a collaborative relationship with the community versus what might be the antithesis of that, which we see with some projects, and that is we're just going to ram it, down their throats, litigation. We'll push and kick and shove till this project gets across the finish line, and a lot of times, frankly, those projects don't make it across the finish line. Um, any thoughts, Lauren, in terms of what you've seen kind of from the perspective of looking at both of those approaches?
Yeah, like platitudes and elbowing up and trying to just jam through is ultimately may be effective if you can convince 5 board members, but ultimately you have to exist and operate in that community. And these neighbors are going to be your neighbors forever, ideally. So jamming a project through, just from a practical perspective, if you think you can do that, by all means, try. I just can't imagine that it would be successful. And the goal of the zoning approval process is to take feedback and respond to it and develop a project that's consistent with the regulations that apply to everybody, not just data centers, and really be able to articulate based on what's in the available public record, what feedback did we receive as a developer, and articulate how the project design doesn't implicate any of the concerns that have been raised, or how the project design was addressed or modified such that it's no longer a concern. So rather than ramming a project through, keeping a careful record of, this is the feedback we've received, this is what we've offered, and this is how we think the project meets the need to develop the site and doesn't implicate this concern.
Terrific. Thank you, Lauren. So Kant, you and your colleagues came to that fork in the road, right? You had an idea, a concept for a data center, business plan, all of that. And, you came to that fork in the road where you're either going to kind of work with the community. It might take time, but, there's an element of transparency. There's listening versus talking over. And then there's the other approach that Lauren was just talking about of getting the elbows up and, just scorched earth to get it through. Give us your thought process, your company's thought process, and some of the lessons you learned from how do you approach a data center project from its earliest public view, if you will, to getting it across the finish line?
Sure. No, I appreciate that. So as you guys know, we develop and operate large-scale digital infrastructure, not just within the current region, but in a number of different regions. So have gone through this process, but our home base is in Niagara Falls. We've operated there as a part of the community since 2019, with about 50 megawatts energized today. And I work in between kind of the development and the operation. So I'll try and keep this as practical as possible in the sense that, what it takes from getting steel in the ground and load operating, and some of the lessons that we learned the hard way. So maybe I'll kind of touch on four. So I'll start with, to me, it starts with power is the project, right? I think everything else is downstream. I think a lot of folks will look at the building, the real estate, the chips. Really, the thing that is the most scarce right now is energized, deliverable power available immediately, right? So if we can solve for that first, then we can actually go in and solve for the other things in terms of the site selection, right? So site control without having that power isn't really an asset. It's more of a liability for us. We chose Niagara Falls because of the transmission, the proximity to hydro generation, and it was built for heavy load, right? We didn't pick it really for the pretty views. We picked it really because of the story about real long-term from a power perspective. Our belief is also reuse beats greenfield, right? So a site that already had heavy power beats kind of a prettier one that doesn't, right? In the sense that I know it's a little bit counterintuitive, but an old industrial site is not a problem, right? And if you think about the region, it's full of legacy power infrastructure that was probably sitting underused, right? So our goal was to come in and really look at remediating the site, making it near new again, and I would say putting modern load back onto that site that it was meant and it was built for. And you tend to move faster in doing that and have more acceptance from a community perspective than carving up kind of greenfield, right? We don't chase the pretty parcels, I'll say. On the community front, we're huge believers that the community is a key stakeholder. They're not an obstacle. And to me, I think the permitting is downstream of the trust. And I think we've worked with the Phillips Lytle team and the community and the city to really do just that. There's a lot of myths we've been talking about here in terms of the impact of data centers, right? And there's a lot of community questions that are valid questions to ask, right? Around noise, water, traffic, jobs. These are all fair. They deserve real answers. And for us, we want to make sure that we're upfront in answering those, and we're also taking that feedback and incorporating that into the design. I think Lauren mentioned that as we're getting the feedback, we've actually augmented and changed the design elements to allow for us to make sure we're meeting the requirements of the community, right? So for us, I really feel like we've earned our place since 2019 in Niagara Falls. We showed up before we needed anything by working with the city up front, not just handing, I would say a plan and saying, hey, I'm looking for a rubber stamp, but really incorporating a lot of that feedback and working through that process along the way, right? So oftentimes it's a slower at the start, but it tends to allow you to move much faster for a long-term project, especially because you are a part of the community, right? And then I would say the last thing is, just to, I would say, be super honest about jobs, right? Jobs are always really critical. Everybody has, a data center is not a traditional factory that was running with thousands and thousands of jobs. However, I will tell you there is real meaningful jobs in the hundreds, if not the thousands, right, that can get there, right, through the construction process, the trades during the build, the ongoing operating phase in terms of the supply chain, the engineering, the electrical, the fiber. So for us, that the energization is really a magnet for those jobs and really provides concrete, meaningful, and I would say in some cases, higher paying jobs for in the next, what I would say, industrial evolution, right? In terms of this data center evolution, right? So we are always working with the local, David, I know we met with the local universities in terms of intern programs. Those things are super important to us to allow to do that. And in some cases, we're also starting to actually evolve into retrain programs as we're developing the sites. If there are local factories or potential manufacturing facilities that may not be operating anymore, we'd love to actually look at those folks to be able to retrain them to actually apply from a data center standpoint. So those are some of the key lessons. I think for us, it's super important that we're a part of the community. We're in all of the sites that we look at and all of the communities we operate, we want to be a part of that community, right? So we're not there to we're not leasing a building. We're a taxpayer. We are owning and operating that facility because we want to be a part of that community for the long term.
And the good news is it can work when you approach it that way, which is one of the key elements we were hoping to touch on today. Kant, we often hear the word transparency when it comes to just this process of going from a concept to an operating data center. And some developers we know of, they take kind of a dim view or don't necessarily embrace transparency. There's a lot of concerns about competitive information getting out there and somehow being viewed as giving power to those that are against your data center. So the whole thing's kind of close to the vest and, submit as little information as possible, all of those things. It sounds like you guys use a bit of a different approach. And how do you view transparency in this context?
I think a lot of this is there are a lot of myths out there, right? So for us, I think we're doing our part to do whatever we can to kind of educate in terms of both the industry and kind of where we think things are going, hopefully dispelling some of those myths. Like I'll give you the example, everyone's talking about, water, for example. Oh, from a cooling perspective with the new technology. Well, the reality is the technology is advanced so far that it's all closed loop, right? So meaning we're actually using very little water, right? We're not draining Niagara Falls of its water. We're using very little water. In some cases, even less than a restaurant in the region, right? In the sense that yes, when you look at some of these projects and they're at scale, there's a lot of attention being put. But for us, it's about how do we educate, both the community and the stakeholders to make sure that we're doing right by each other, right? Because we want to operate in not just a transparent way, but we want to operate, like I said, for the long term.
Great. So Dennis, one of the key issues, and you flagged this early on, one of the key issues that somebody like Kant and his colleagues face is making sure that there is enough energy, even if they can have the transmission capabilities to get it there, with increasing demands for more energy. And in New York, with the Climate Leadership Act, there's been but for some of the renewables, there's been kind of a dearth of new generation coming online in the state. How do you see that playing out so that New York can be, embrace and welcome folks like Block Fusion and others to the region?
Yeah. So the direction that I've heard the governor state is she uses the term all the above solutions. That has not always been the case. If you look at the previous, let's say since the Climate Act was brought forward in 2019, previous that energy policy has actually shut down coal plants. It's limited permits for natural gas generation. These are all base supply 24/7. And so what we've done is we've disrupted what would refer to as an efficient energy system where you have a pure balance of supply, demand, and delivery. I think we retired something like 4.4 gigawatts of fossil generation, replaced it with 2.5 gigawatts of renewable energy. So policy is actually creating this disconnect between consumption and supply. And we've got to bring those back together again. So thinking about ideas like, well, we'd like data centers to contribute to the growth of renewable energy. They're definitely not against that, but does it solve the transmission capacity problem? So looking at it and say, can you put 100 megawatt renewable energy farm on your site? It would just at 5 acres a megawatt. Think about how difficult that would be to accomplish. So what they're really asking them to do is subsidize those type of supply generation build outs elsewhere. They're disconnected. But we always got to remember that doesn't solve the capacity problem. But even if they do put renewable energy on site, they've got to consider the intermittency side of it. So if there's intermittency, they've got to include that in the manner in which they operate. So they may actually have to have, battery storage or some other. But you start to look at the costs going up, and we still haven't yet solved the transmission capacity issue. So there's a lot of opportunity here because, as Kant pointed out, he sees himself as a community partner. And most developers, I say, is that, well, how do I help my local community? Well, the regulatory process isn't set up that way yet, and it needs to evolve to being that. So if you take something like the system benefit charge for just an example, 30% of the utilities delivery charge goes into the system benefit charge, and then it goes into the NYSERDA programming. What if that was actually kept local? And we started looking at, well, how can we address co-location of supply and demand? Is there an opportunity of an all the above solution using technologies like fuel cells or linear generators that are extremely low emissions options? And so we've got to really rethink the models that we have in place. It's not a money issue, which is intriguing. It's actually a transmission capacity issue. And we like to think that transmission capacity is a whole new problem, like it just fell out of the sky because of data centers. I will tell you, I've been doing this for 40 years. Transmission capacity is always a problem. The magnitudes are what's different today. And the ability of understanding that utilities have to work with these developers for more of a prospective view on transmission planning, because that way you can integrate the recovery into the process long term. We have a focus on nuclear. Well, how do we get there in 10 to 15 years if we don't have data center loads in order to support that? And again, I apologize for using the term data center load. Loads of this nature are going to be what is going to allow New York to control the long-term view of its cost structure. And there's a real opportunity today to think forward, bring power purchase agreements as part of the conversation, bring in virtual power plants to kind of like solve this integration of supply, demand, and delivery. If you just focus on supply, you don't remove the transmission constraint. If you don't remove the transmission constraint, you can't control your costs. And that's the balance that I think we need. And it's heartening to hear Kant say, no, we're a community partner. And so why does these line item subsidies go into some uh, long distance process when in fact we're just trying to resolve the affordability of electricity in New York? And the way to do that is to employ some good, sound business acumen where the developer is a partner to this. And if that money stays locally, it's a direct connection with their company vision. And so they get that because it's a money issue. It's not a policy or an emotional issue. And those are easier to pass through their performance.
No doubt about that. So, what's New York's reaction to all of this? Most recently, it's been the legislature, and I'm being precise in my words here. Governor has not taken any action yet, but the legislature has passed a moratorium, and with other provisions related to data centers. In my view, it's taking the shotgun out to address a sore finger. I think a number of the concerns and issues, and all three of you, frankly, have touched on this. There's questions, there's issues that they're concerns, and frankly, if they're held by a number of folks whether it's statewide or in individual communities, they need to be addressed, whether they're correct, whether they're red herrings, whether they're purposeful misstatements. They need to be addressed, right? You can't ignore them, as we certainly heard from both Lauren and Kant. But the moratorium, and certainly in my view, is not the right way to go. The inconsistencies within the act, to me, are really chilling. We understand, that the legislation would put in place a one-year moratorium on data centers, of a certain size or greater. And it's a one-year moratorium. We know that that's proposed because those that drafted the legislation are trying to fall within certain confines to make sure that any moratorium would fall within the approvable and acceptable range for moratoria generally. Yet, here we are with other parts of this act that require the New York State DEC and others to perform studies that under the act, they're given 18 months to get through them. And all of us know state government well enough that it's highly unlikely that in a good year that they would make the 18-month timeline. So what ends up happening? Well, Lauren touched on it before. You start out with a year, they get towards the end of that year. Gee, we're not haven't completed these studies yet. This information we're looking for, we're going to need to extend the moratorium. And I'm personally concerned that a one-year moratorium could relatively quickly turn into a 2 or 3 year moratorium, just given what the state purportedly wants to accomplish during the pendency of that moratorium. So, with that in mind, how does something like this potential moratorium, how does that impact sort of your business decision making? When you're looking at new sites, when you've got limited bandwidth in terms of how many sites you can be considering at any point in time, and you've obviously got financial constraints. How does something like that impact you?
Yeah, so I would say definitely we always have our pulse in terms of what's going on both at the state and at the local level. As I understand it, as it's drafted, it really targets kind of new air quality permits for data centers as you said, of a particular size versus kind of existing operations. For us, it's something that does give us pause, but I think we feel fairly confident in terms of where we are right now from a state perspective. We've worked through these issues in the past with respect to some of the local regulations, and we see a huge opportunity in New York State. I think there's a huge opportunity to operate and I look at it not as stop signs but more as standards, right? So how do we kind of work on developing those standards together, and how do we make sure that we really start to operate and we can operate at scale and do something really phenomenal. New York has a ton of potential within this market. We're seeing a lot of other states that are really tapping into this, and unfortunately these while I understand that standards may need to be put in place, we also don't want to risk the fact that the state gets left behind, right? In terms of where the investment is going. In our case, this is, like I said, our home base. We believe in it. We want to be able to invest in it. We want to work with, the folks to be able to make sure that the right standards are being put in place.
Agreed. So Lauren, when we have a data center developer coming into a community, identifying a site, you mentioned earlier that, particularly if this is the first time that a community is seeing a bona fide data center proposal, one of the approaches would be to, say, hey, wait a minute, we need to update our code. We need to, put a pause on development. How, from your perspective, how critical is it for, the developer in that scenario to be involved and engage in that code setting process?
It's crucial, that public hearing process on any local law. So an initial moratorium may be passed upon an application percolating in a community. If there's nothing you can do and the moratorium's enacted and you have a 6-month pause, project design can essentially still proceed because common sense reasonable site design is probably going to dovetail with common sense reasonable site plan and special use permit regulations. In terms of the developer contributing during a moratorium period. So inwardly, internally, like Kant saying, not a stop sign, just a pause. Keep going with your project design. And then in terms of directly interfacing with the legislative body at the local level to offer industry perspectives on what are feasible restrictions and what can this particular industry do to be responsive to the concerns. We know off the top of our heads it's going to be electricity, water, noise, and consistency with community character. So those are your sort of buckets of concern. Those could be addressed in a set of site plan regulations. Those could be addressed in supplemental regulations or a set of special use permit standards or through an overlay district. There's any number of tools that a municipality could use and could develop during a moratorium and then enact. So for example, as the developer, you want to get some written comments in that explain the nature of the use, that it's consistent with other industrial uses, that it can be handled under similar standards that the code already offers, or if there is some relevant tweak that is necessary for the data center space in that particular community, offer that. And the approach should always be, we're here to offer common sense contributions to regulations that allow these sites to be developed consistent with the municipality's comprehensive plans, which as a general matter are calling for redevelopment of and reinvestment in vacant or industrial sites that are currently underutilized. So to the extent that you can bring these projects in, graft on some new regulations or new supplemental provisions into a code to just deal with these specific data center concerns. So the community members are sure that their concerns are addressed clearly in their local code. And that also ultimately benefits data center developers. When you get to the end of a moratorium and there's legislation adopted, you know you have that municipality's buy-in on what's allowed, how it's going to be allowed, and what your set of discretionary approvals is going to be. So at the end of the moratorium, as a developer, you'd like that new legislation to be your roadmap to approval. So there's a real benefit to participating in that process, offering common sense industry feedback on any regulations that are proposed, and then look forward to putting in an application consistent with those regulations once they're adopted.
It's a holistic approach that makes an awful lot of sense. Dennis, you talked earlier about the sort of all of the above energy supply strategy. One of the other concepts that we're hearing more and more about, and I would say this may be a kind of a New York centric thing, is the notion that the data center, should bring its energy supply with it in some fashion, whether that's virtually or literally having energy generation cheek to jowl with the data center project. What are you seeing? How do you think that's ultimately going to play out?
I do believe that the future is co-locating generation and demand, uh, n- simply because the process is not geared to speed to market. If you look at the standard interconnection process today, it probably takes, let's say, 2 to 3 years to go through the New York ISO system impact study process. It takes an additional year to go through the utilities facility study process, and then an additional 3 to 4 years to look at the construction schedule that the utility will put. That's 6 to 8 years. So the idea of a moratorium is kind of strange. If we can't solve this within the current cycle, I'm not sure I understand that fully. You're starting to see the FERC step up, Dave, in terms of opening up different ideas. They're looking at how do we create a much more efficient study process. I'm sure Kant would bob his head up and down on that. That's needed. They're also looking at, instead of these first in, first out processes where we have one developer come in, second, third, and then you're dealt with in a queue, treat it like we do a renewable energy in a cluster study. So if you do it that way, kind of like you can think about, well, how do we all share in what the real solution is? And I think you're going to start seeing co-location evolve into microgrids, because microgrids has the opportunity of combining the co-location of supply and demand, but also creating a community benefit because you can overbuild the supply at the point of use. But New York is got a contradiction. New York is very focused on renewable energy. They're focused on solar, wind, and battery storage, which they're all good mixes. But if you don't solve the 24/7 base supply, we're not going to get to a point where you're controlling costs across the board. So you can really think about potential opportunity of new businesses or existing business, some great existing businesses that have a microgrid philosophy. So they may step in and say, well, what's the cost of the transmission upgrades? What's the cost impact on potential ratepayers? I have a standalone solution that I'll provide to the local developer. We've got to get more open to these type of concepts. And the FERC specifically mentions small modular reactors and natural gas type of solutions, whether they're turbines, linear generators, or fuel cells. If you look at an all the above solution, you have a higher probability of lowering your emissions by having multiple options versus an all or nothing approach, because probability will tell you that if it's all or nothing, you'll always get closer to nothing than all. And that's the engineering side of this. It's not an emotional side. So individuals like Black Fusion and Kant will tell you we want to be part of that long-term solution. If your future is nuclear, what do I do today to bridge myself to that future so that my load actually contributes to controlling the cost of a future supply that includes nuclear? Because my worry is if you continue to separate these issues, you're going to see more of these zero energy credits having to subsidize nuclear and not have the business community engaged in a longer view on how to align supply, demand, and delivery. I went through 3 years of the Climate Action Council, and I tried to bring up the issue of it's really transmission and distribution capacity. If we can solve that, a lot of the other issues kind of come together, because then you marry everything into one integrated resource solution. And you're going to find that the data center people, and if you don't believe me, ask Kant, they want to be part of that solution because they're in it for the long haul. They're not trying to do something that's a year to 5 years. They're setting themselves up for a very strong future. And this is not a discussion that's happening only in New York. We have a lot to learn from other states. Some other states are actually working directly with these type of alternative fuel providers where the utility actually is owning a fuel cell or a linear generator to capture the market to respond to what Kant's needs are today. But what's their real play? They're aligning their purchase agreements with these fuel cell folks with their transmission plan or with their nuclear plan. And so basically, in 10 years, they're feeding through a fuel cell, but at the end of 10 years, they're feeding through their transmission system, which allows direct contribution to benefit all ratepayers.
So Kant is, I think it's a good segue to kind of a broader sustainability question that I have, and that is, there's oftentimes opponents to data center projects will paint them with the brush. You mentioned there's the use of water, greenhouse gas emissions, just using unconscionable amounts of electricity, and how could that in any way mesh with kind of a sustainability agenda? Yeah, I know how important sustainability is to you personally as well as the company. Yeah, how do you make those things fit?
It absolutely is, David, and I think that was one of the first things my co-founder Alex and I, when we embarked on this several years ago, was we wanted to make sure, and we believe it for the long haul. We both have children, young children, and we want to make sure we're doing right for their future just as much as we are now, and for what we're operating in. So our site is emission free. We want to work in areas, and even the site selection that we're doing, even if it was, for example, an industrial site before, we look where we can actually go and remediate that site and actually go and convert it to clean energy, right? So if you remember, this site used to be a coal-fired power plant. It's no longer a coal-fired power plant, right? So and then when we look at, say, from a generation standpoint, for us, we participate in things like demand response, right? To make sure that when there is peak usage required, let's say within the particular region, we actually shed our load, and we're probably one of the fastest in the region in the sense that within less than 10 minutes, we're basically shedding 50 megawatts of load and sending that back into the grid to make sure that we can do that. We participate in those programs because we believe in making sure that we're doing right by the community and the ratepayers as well. And then even as Dennis said, as we're looking at other sites and or engineering future designs, it's always based on where can we incorporate some level of this generation. So we are exploring absolutely this fuel cell technology, right? We are exploring BESS technology, right? That allows us to basically look at so we could still potentially participate in some demand response when the utility requires that load back. We can actually still operate as normal, and it's transparent in terms of our operation, but no impact there. But we're also participating in making sure we're doing right by it. So all of our, we have to I think Dennis was absolutely right to say we want to be a part of that discussion. We want to be working with the utility in terms of going through that designs. We're making investments for the long term. This is not just, oh, okay, we're going to do this and for the next 5 years. We're talking about decades worth of investment that will take decades for us to recoup. So if we have to make that investment, we want to do it the right way to make sure that we're going to operate in that region for those decades, and that we can actually make sure that we're operating in a way that, we're future proofing the technology that we're putting in place.
Agreed. Thanks, Kant. So we've received a few questions, which is a good thing. So I'd like to just kind of parse out these questions amongst our panel here as we get towards the end of our program here this morning. For you, Lauren, question: Are there examples of any recent or perhaps even not so recent zoning code updates in New York municipalities that are helpful or can be a mechanism for allowing the development of data centers in industrial and or commercial areas?
I'll just keep on theme here with the city of Niagara Falls and use this as a case study for the block fusion experience. But for example, 2019, 2020, block fusion starts to operate. The city of Niagara Falls in the summer of 2022 and finally in the fall of 22 adopted a series of zoning regulations updates. The city's approach there was to treat high energy uses, which included data center uses, cryptocurrency mining facilities, and several others, to treat those as uses that are only allowed in an overlay district. So this is an example of a municipality adopting a multiple board review. So a rezoning required from the municipality's legislative body, a site plan review required by the planning board, and a special use permit review required by the zoning board of appeals. And the key components of that legislation were additional setbacks that changed depending on the nature of the site's proximity to industrial uses as compared to lesser intensity commercial or residential uses, buffering requirements, screening requirements, and one interesting item that Niagara Falls used in their regulations to get at noise was a limitation on exposed apparatus on the building. And like Kant has pointed out, though technologies are changing in the development of these facilities themselves, even as a municipality adopts an updated data center regulation in early 2022, a regulation like limiting the percentage of your facility that can have exposed apparatus on it is clearly a mechanism to get at exhaust fans, which are one of the perceived sources of noise for the facility. So Niagara Falls is an example. Those are some of the key pieces of it and how they grabbed at the data centers in particular.
I think that's certainly a helpful case study. No question about it.
That was
Yeah.
that was into September 2022 is when Niagara Falls adopted that.
Very good, thank you. Kant, one of our questions is kind of the balancing process. You know, you have your needs and wants and desires as a developer. The community, you know, has its needs and wants and desires. Don't necessarily mesh up, at least from the get-go. How do you end up balancing, you know, those potentially conflicting or potentially inconsistent desires and goals? You know, what's your process for doing that?
Yeah, David, I wouldn't necessarily say they're inconsistent or they're opposing. I think it's just a matter of incorporating in terms of the upfront and the design, the key requirements and the feedback, right? So I'll give you a really good example. I think Lauren just mentioned with respect to some of the zoning and the exhaust fans. So we evolved the design, right? I think we took that feedback and through some of the studies that we did in terms of testing from a noise standpoint, we looked at what things could we do to actually help mitigate that and get it not just kind of at the level required, but well below that level required, right? And a lot of that was just modifying the design elements of it, right? And taking that feedback and incorporating it in, right? So when you think about the key things that right now are top of mind, right? Energy being one of them, water, noise. A lot of the technology is changing in the sense that from a water perspective, using closed loop, cooling technology, now all of a sudden brings everything indoor. You're not actually using the amount of water that, I would say, historically data centers may have been using. When I say historically, I mean, the advancements as you look at things like AI and HPC computing, a lot of that is changing with respect to the requirements because you cannot use an air-cooled facility for the latest and greatest technology. It has to be liquid cooled. And when you do that, it has to be closed loop because the amount of water that you would require if you were to do it, I would say the way things were done decades ago it just doesn't sustain itself. So technologies change to actually adapt to the requirement. Same thing on the, the exhaust fans. Like our as we're evolving our engineering, we're kind of looking at, okay, how can we move everything indoors? All the electrical infrastructure will go indoors. All the cooling is now closed loop. There's no fans on, that over time there'll be no fans and things on the roof. So those things will evolve and change because the technology is driving that. But what we're doing is making sure we've got a really good pulse on what's that feedback and making sure that let's not do it after the fact. Let's make sure we're incorporating it right from the get-go as we're designing this and incorporating that feedback right from the start. No different than the work that we're doing with Dennis and team here, which is okay. Let's think about what we need to do in terms of sustainability, right? How do we make sure that we can actually participate in these demand response programs, but still be able to operate normally on a 24/7 basis, right? How do we make sure, is there other ways to generate that we can do to help augment? Those things are all being taken into consideration upfront as a part of the design process.
The enlightened approach, no question
Yeah.
about it, and to your point, the successful one. So a good lesson learned there. Dennis, we've got a question. Hyperscalers like Google and Google's plan to invest 100 megawatts of distributed energy resources like batteries and demand response within the PJM territory. In your view, is that something that's transferable to New York and the New York ISO?
Yeah, so as Dave pointed out, I'm not an attorney. I am an engineer. And it depends. And it actually depends on the network that you're connecting that to. Because if you don't have 100 megawatts worth of capacity off peak to charge the battery storage in addition to supplying the data center, then you can't discharge something that's not charged. So part of the lessons that we have got to get better at is it's not about goals. It's actually about defining the problem and then addressing the problem holistically and pragmatically. And that's where you're going to find developers like Kant step up and say, no, I need to be part of that solution because we need a much more flexible operating. So when we make statements like renewable energy on site, battery storage on site, you're neglecting the potential opportunity of solving the real constraint, which is transmission capacity. Because if we can do that, and we can do that as a collective, that's good for everyone. And the other thing we've got to get better at is, and I want to leak into the community benefit piece, we have Empire AI at the University of Buffalo. Can't mention that there's a real opportunity here for workforce development internships. But the bigger play here is how does AI infiltrate transmission planning? How does it create an efficient energy system? How would it send out different signals and actually treat a company like Kant as part of the infrastructure, as a part of some separate entity that's standing there on its own, that's trying to put in battery storage, on-site generation, or other, an integrated solution, and batteries is a part of that if the network can support it. And that's the key that we have got to always go back to, making sure that we're not really just emotional or focused on the ideology of something, but let's take the time to define the problem. Because when you define the problem, you create major opportunities for industry, for business, for secondary services that our people are looking at. Well, we'll provide Kant a full service utility process that will support the electric infrastructure. But we can't look at technology in isolation. Unfortunately, we did that with natural gas. We wanted to shut down natural gas. It's not conceivable. Prices are volatile the way they are today because of what we've done with energy policy. We don't want to keep repeating that. We shut down hydrofracking. We've shut down coal plants and natural gas plants. But we didn't replace it with transmission capacity or alternative generation, which would have actually levelized the impact on prices or controlled the volatility of prices. So I would encourage everyone with these great technology ideas to think about how they complement other technologies or other management philosophies that one would have. Because I'll tell you, the data center industry is open to ideas, but they want to do those ideas that build a better community and a much more resilient electric system.
Unfortunately, that makes terrific sense, which means it'll be difficult to get people on board with.
We're trying, Dave.
I know you are. I know you are. Lauren, a question for you, because I know you, not just in the context of data centers, but generally with larger projects and local reviews and approvals. The question is, have you seen community opposition translate into hostility from zoning boards and could be a ZBA, anything like that? And have you needed to change tactics to convince them on a particular project?
In my experience, the members of planning boards, zoning boards, city, town, village councils are genuinely doing their level best to apply the regulations that are in front of them to a specific project. And of course, the feeling in a hearing room, if there are 100 hissing constituents, can influence any board member. And I think that the right approach is to be standing there representing a project that is well designed, responsive to the relevant actual land use standards and the seeker standards, the standard environmental review associated with any discretionary approval in New York, and be able to show in the record, based on actual data that's been developed by the private developer, fully vetted by the municipality's reviewing staff and any expert consultants that are necessary to review technical documents, and offer the information in the record as the item that will cool the temperature. Because if there tends to be heated opposition from either a member of the community or a board member itself, which frankly I have not personally experienced opposition or a predetermined no from a board member in this context, I genuinely think these board members appreciate that this is a new and emerging industry and that they have a job to do, which is to issue a determination that's supported by the record and consistent with the law and that developer's right to develop its property. So as a zoning attorney, forgive me for pointing to this, but it's the administrative record and the data that you've offered in support of your project and the statements that you're making that is really the best strategy to respond to heated objections, whether they come from a resident, a neighbor, a municipal staff member, or a board member.
Thank you. Kant, we've heard Elon Musk talk about the potential for data centers in space. But before we send you out to get measured for your spacesuit, do you see any of that as being a reality? And if so, is something like that complementary to your types of data centers, or is it an eventual replacement? How do you see those stars aligning?
Yeah, no, you're seeing a lot of things in the news right now, definitely in terms of advancements, and I'll give you my opinion. So I would say both the underwater and the space-based data centers, they're technically possible. But I said, from my perspective, I don't think either are likely to replace traditional data centers. And when I say traditional, I don't mean legacy data centers of previous. I mean now basically what's happening from an AI perspective, right? If you think about underwater, they have, I would say, a better near-term use case because, the ocean water provides, very low-cost cooling. Space data centers, from my perspective, face kind of some major challenges, right? Cost, maintenance, radiation, latency, data transmission. I would say that the underwater facilities are probably, will have a more economically, viable application in the next 5 to 15 years. The space-based data centers, I think they're still working through that, right? But from my perspective, I still think the vast majority of the I would say computing will continue to be what I'll call earthbound, right? Because it's far easier to build, operate, maintain, upgrade from a longer term perspective, right? So I would just say, there's going to be a ton of advancements over the next 10 to 20 years, but a lot of that is going to be, I would say, more focused on kind of the cooling, the power generation that we talked about, and kind of the high density computing, rather than kind of not necessarily moving from everything from land to underwater or space. That would be my take on it. So, but I'm equally fascinated by all of the advancements that Elon Musk and team are making. So I can't wait to see it. Yeah.
Just wait, and there'll be more, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Lauren, the noise issue, I know you've talked about it a couple times as being oftentimes a key issue with local reviews and approvals. In your experience, how is the noise issue being addressed? One of the things you mentioned was through, design changes and modifications, but, how is that being addressed? And the question is, why is it occurring in places like Mississippi and Texas? I don't know if you've got any feel for that, or why that would be different from noise issues here, but how are they being addressed?
Yeah, so noise is, I frankly love a noise issue because it's measurable and you can establish whether or not you're actually contributing to noise levels with data. So most municipalities, well, for example, we're in New York, any discretionary zoning approval has to receive for a data center, would have to receive a seeker review. Seeker is a State Environmental Quality Review Act. The state has pretty consistent standards for what is considered noise that's disruptive and what noise is imperceptible from the background. So typically 6 decibels or more increases in background noises from a particular project would be a threshold where local reviewers would have to start thinking this is an impact and we have to mitigate or think about buffers or setbacks or something to control that noise issue. So if I may again use the Block Fusion case study, in that context, noise was one of the key concerns for the city. There is a residential area 800 feet to the east of the facility. The key way for the developer to deal with noise was to establish that when the facility is operating and when the facility is not operating, the residential receptors, the folks sitting on their front porch, can't tell a difference. And if you can establish that, you've dealt with noise from the developer perspective. And then in terms of a municipality, thinking about what sort of regulations can we put in place, I just would encourage reference to Seeker. Seeker has been dealing with the noise issue for the last 30 years. It's beat to death, and the exact same analysis applies in the data center context as any other user. And while I can't, without understanding the specific suggestion about noise being different in Mississippi or Texas, just based on those states and the existing infrastructure there, if you're going in a raw land field and there's not a lick of other noise around and there's no baseline noise and the area has been silent except for birds chirping for the last 100 years, boy, do you have an uphill climb in terms of dealing with noise, whether you're the municipality or the developer. So I would again point to this northeastern market, New York in particular. There are a lot of legacy industrial sites. For example, again, I'm pointing to City of Niagara Falls. Forgive me for referencing back to that example, but it's the company and we're keeping this morning. that city and many other cities similarly situated are really built out from an industrial perspective. Those neighborhoods came up around heavy industrial users, and there is some tolerance for industry noise. The question is, does it depart from the baseline for that municipality? So if that municipality and the residents there have been operating comfortably at a 55 or 60 decibel limit, that's sort of how you want to be thinking of noise in the data center context. If it's a rural area where at the residential property lines, you're looking at 35 or 40 or 45 decibels, that's where you need to be thinking of as your noise range. So I would imagine that that would be dramatically different on a farm field in Texas, as opposed to an already heavily developed industrial area in a northeastern state.
Very good. Well, I think we're getting close to our end time here. We're again respectful of not just our panelists' time today, but those of you who have been listening to us this morning. So we appreciate everyone joining us. I think, you know, there's some common themes here that there is a path forward, you know, to get a data center sited and developed and operating. There's also a lot of dead ends if you take the wrong approach that can leave you, you know, without a viable project at the end of it. So hopefully you've got some insights into how you may consider moving a project forward. I think it's equally important. All of our panelists have touched on, you know, what an opportunity data centers can continue to be for New York, and it would be a shame if the state or any of us continued to take steps that sort of pushed back or just made it increasingly difficult to put a data center in New York. As Kant most appropriately pointed out, you know, there's limited resources. You've got to focus on sites that are real and projects that are real, and the more roadblocks, issues, concerns, limitations that you put in place, it swings attention and it swings commitment to sites that may not have that same grouping of restraints and constraints in the system. So I think there's a lot to be thought of in terms of how you can actually move a data center project forward. I'd like to thank our panelists, Lauren Adornetto, Kant Trivedi, and Dennis Elsenbeck for joining us this morning. And thank you all for being with us as well. And we hope you found this informative. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Ellen.
you.